the second one is about mitigating, not pruning, but mitigating UTXO bloat. So let's jump right into it. The thing I want, one of the key takeaways is that there are two kinds of consensus, two kinds of way we reach an agreement. One is a cryptographic consensus, where we can say, okay, there are stuff that we all know we agree about because we can mathematically verify it, and it's very hard to forge. So, for example, if I download Bitcoin and check that all the headers have the difficulty, the correct difficulty, and have the correct structure, that's cryptographic. The second form of consensus is social consensus. Is knowing it's essentially whenever you rely on the collective knowledge of society to get convinced on someone. For example, there is no way to prove that a bank has never been robbed, right? The best proof that can be provided is just saying, look, if we were robbed, then people would know about it. It would have been noticed and documented. And now we ask ourselves, does blockchain technology, like does Bitcoin, rely on social consensus? So what do you think? Does it?
No. Yeah.
Well, it does, and it must. You can't. If I join the Bitcoin network today, there is no way you can prove to me that there wasn't a 5-year-long reorg that ended yesterday. You can't prove anything about what happened and what other chains existed, or you can't prove that they didn't exist. The only thing you can prove is that right now I have a chain that looks good, but why should I trust you? This is an example of where we rely on social consensus. And the takeaway here is there is no everlasting consensus without some degree of social consensus. You can't have everything be cryptographic, even in Bitcoin. And now I'm going to talk about essentially the three properties that interest us when we validate a chain. The first is the integrity of the chain. The integrity of the chain is just saying that consensus-wise, everything looks good. As I said before, all headers point to the previous headers, all the pointers are fine, you have all of the difficulty, the chain weight is authentic, and so on. The second is consistency. It's looking at the data inside the blocks and look at the state at what is supposed to be, and that it developed this way in a way that is organic and there were no manipulations along the way. And the third one is authenticity. Authenticity means I know that this chain really reflects what's happened and it wasn't manipulated in any way, including 51% attacks and reorgs. And the point is that integrity always can and should be validated cryptographically. And authenticity can never be validated cryptographically and must always rely on social consensus. So what happened in the middle with the consistency? So right now, in Bitcoin, the consistency is also validated cryptographically because you have the entire ledger and you can just verify it one by one. Okay, so I'll just skip this slide because I already said it. So the main observation behind pruning is that if you want to use cryptographic to consensus to validate consistency, you have to have something which is about the size of the entire ledger. You might compress it a little bit, but only by constant factor because of information theory. And the idea is that you don't really need a cryptographic consensus for the consistency of the network. You don't need to indefinitely keep proofs forever of everything that ever happened. You can delegate it to the social consensus. And to do this, you only need one assumption, that there is some agreed upon depth f, which could be large, like about a day, that there are no reorgs beyond this depth. And I will refer to f just as a day. And it doesn't mean that such reorgs are impossible. It's just like this border. We say if we have a reorg which is a whole day deep, then we need to take a step back and say, guys, it's time for human intervention. So either way, this will cause the chain to halt, even if it's not ingrained into the code. Okay, so with this assumption in mind, how can we prune? So I'm going to do this in two parts. I'm going to talk about the data and the header. So the idea in pruning the block data is that essentially all data is not needed to validate new transactions. All you need essentially is the UTXO set and the recent data to validate the UTXO set, to see that there wasn't recent changes. Okay, so what we can do, we can just take all data that is sufficiently old and delete it. But the concern is what we call a difficulty attack. Sorry, it's a mistake on the slide. It should be pruning attack. A pruning attack is any way that someone can force a node to require data on an arbitrarily old block, but for cheap. It doesn't need to be as powerful as the network to do it. And essentially, if you can do it, then you can't prune, because you might need arbitrarily old blocks to validate transactions. So in blockchains, pruning data is very straightforward. We just say any data that is older than a day, any block that is older than a day, we discard the data, right? And we only process blocks that are on the earliest chain. So the only way to make me require a block that is 2 days old is to create a reorg that is 2 days deep. So this is exactly the security that we wanted. Pruning block data in block DAGs is much harder. It's very hard. And why is it so hard? Because I can point at an old block and a new block at the same time and create a block that on one hand would be processed and on the other hand required very old data. So an example of that, like let's see a naive attempt to prune data attacks, we can say, okay, what if we impose the following rule? Any two blocks that you point of, the distance between them can't be too much. It's bounded by some constant L. So to see why this doesn't work, look at this chain. It has, I divided it into segments of length L, and then an attacker can do this thing. First point at a very old block, then point at these two blocks, and then at these two blocks, and so on. And eventually, they will manage to point at the top, but require the very old block to be processed, and the hash rate they need to do it is just 1 over L plus 1 of the global hash rate. So even you set L to, I don't know, 3, then a 25% attacker can completely ruin your pruning. And so without going into details, I'll just say that it took us about a year to Jonathan Stanpolinsky, Michael Sutton, and myself to come up with pruning rules for block data that actually work and prove that they are secure and there are no pruning attacks. And if you want more information about it, look up a video called Ghost Tag 101 on YouTube. I explain it in some detail. So that's what I had to say about pruning block data, but is it enough? We still need to prove the chain weight. Right? We still need, when someone inspects the chain, they need to know how much work was put into the chain, because that's exactly what makes it difficult to forge the chain. So the main way to do it is to validate all headers, but for this you need to store all headers. And as I said, this can accumulate quite fast. In Kaspa it accumulates at about 9 gigabytes per day. So you can't do that. To prune block headers, okay, so let's think about how I can do it. The naive approach would be just say, keep the headers of the last day and discard the rest. And you can say, okay, that sounds cool, because in order to forge a chain, I would need to mine for a whole day to produce something which is heavier than the honest chain. And then I need to be as powerful as the honest chain. But where does this fall down? It falls down because I can pre-mine. I can spend a year or 2 years mining something that looks like a day and take my time, and with a fraction of the hash rate, I could create something that looks like a valid less day of a heavier chain. So this is no good. We need to be smarter than that. And the people who are smarter are Kaias, Leonardis, and Zintros, which came up with an extremely cool protocol which called the MLS protocol, or mining in logarithmic space. And the idea is to look at what's called superblocks. Now, I'll remind you that in proof of work, in most proof of work, every block has a difficulty target, a number T, that in order for your block to be valid, the hash of your block must start with T zeros. Right, everyone here is comfortable with this? Fine. So we say that a block is an L superblock if it has at least L more zeros than it should have, just by chance. So the observation is that if I want to purposefully create an L superblock, I would have to work 2 to the L times harder than if I just wanted to create a valid block. But about 2 to the L of the blocks will be L superblocks just by pure chance. And the idea is that every block would point not only to the previous block, but to the previous 1 superblock, the previous 2 superblock, and so on. I won't get into how to exactly choose how much, because that's actually the difficult part, but that's the idea. And using this, we can create what's called a NIPAPOW, if you've heard about it. It's essentially a very, very small collection of headers. And this picture illustrates it, how the number of headers we need as we go back in time goes to 0 very, very fast, and the total amount is logarithmic. But you can verify that this small amount of headers are really from the chain because they form a chain, and their total weight is like the weight of the original chain. Forging this thing, even though it contains just a few headers, is just as hard as forging the original chain. And the MLS protocol, it was adapted to DAX by Ori Newman and implemented in Kaspa. So that's how we prune headers in Kaspa. And the security that MLS gives is very interesting because it remains secure without having a single node in the entire network that stores the history. You just don't need the history to run securely. It has the same security, Nakamoto security as Bitcoin. It has the same trust model. You don't have to add any trusted entities like archival nodes. You can keep an archive if you want, but it's not required. And the proof goes very slowly. It will take about 10,000 years to reach 100 megabytes. So here I did this little table of comparison. We see that pruning increases the ledger data to logarithmic, and the small price we pay is that in terms of consistency, we turn to social consensus instead to cryptographic consensus, but we rely on social consensus anyway because we believe the chain is authentic, so it's hardly a trade-off at all. So if people ask me, how do you know in Kaspa or any other pruned chain that there wasn't an invalid block 2 years ago, I'll say, I can't really know, but what I can tell you is that if there was an invalid block, then anyone could have stored a proof of that. And if the entire network managed to mine over this invalid block advertently because the code they ran would have rejected this block, it means that the entire network wanted it anyway, and it's consensus. I mean, you need much more than 51% to get away with this anyway, and 51% is the security threshold we're all comfortable with anyway. So I'm not convinced it's really a problem or a trade-off, but in return, you get the power to operate on 10 blocks per second, on 3,000 transactions per second, and you will never need more than 100 or 150 gigabytes for the full nodes, which I think is a huge benefit, and that's why syncing a Kaspa node takes 20 minutes. Now, one thing that upsets people sometimes is that now there isn't an immutable ledger. Like in Bitcoin, you have the entire history and it's auditable and verifiable. And even though it's not needed for the Nakamoto consensus security, it's still useful. And people has uses for that, an application for that. So the question is if we can offer an alternative to using this immutable ledger. And the alternative that we can get is what's called a proof of acceptance. As long as a transaction wasn't previously pruned, as long as it's like less than a day old, you can derive a very simple proof that would remain verifiable indefinitely. Now, I want to stress it out. Anyone can create this proof as long as they are fast enough. And after it's created, anyone, not just people who store the archive, even if there is not a single archive, anyone could verify this transaction, validate the authenticity of the claim that this transaction existed in this particular block and was accepted indefinitely, even if the archive is completely lost. So I would say that people who think that blockchains should keep an immutable ledger are unreasonable. The only immutable ledger idea is the absurd idea that all nodes in the network needs to keep a proof of acceptance for the entire history of the network indefinitely, and that's completely unsustainable. So I'm sorry, I'm going to skip a little bit here about how we do it in DAX due to time. I'll just say that if you want information, do it in index is really interesting. Look up Kaspa Improvement Proposal 6 that I wrote. I go into a lot of details there. If you enjoy DAX and graph theory, I think you'd like what you'll see there. There is some interesting bricks there. So one question people can ask is, okay, but what about lost proofs? Okay, what if someone wasn't fast enough and now his transaction is pruned and they can't obtain the proof? So one thing you need to notice is that it doesn't mean the money was lost, because the UTXO is still there and they still have access to the UTXO. The problem is that they can't prove when they got the transaction or from what address or this kind of stuff, which could be important for people. So the first solution we're going to integrate is just to modify the wallets to have an interface for that. They will just automatically generate and store all proofs. And a second solution that I think would exist in parallel is the history as a service. I believe if this will really become an issue, then there would be service providers that maintain archival nodes and provide the service, probably paid service, to retroactively create proofs for you. As long as an archive exists somewhere, all proofs can be created retroactively. So it's not a big issue, especially when you consider the fact that if you lose the proof, it doesn't mean you lose access to your money in any way. Okay, so that's what I had to say about pruning the block data and the ledger data. And now we can move on to talking about the state or about the UTXO block. So what exactly is this so-called state? So essentially the way I like to think about is that the ledger is the history of what happened from the beginning up to now, and the state is everything that we currently agree upon. So for example, in Bitcoin, the state would be the UTXO set. It's just this huge list of all the positive balances, how much they contain, and what is the key that you need to verify a signature to accept spending this UTXO and some more metadata. Okay? And so, as I said, the problem with this UTXO set is that it grows as the network is used. It's required by all nodes if you want the ability to validate transactions. Doesn't matter any, even if it's just transactions that interest you, you need the entire UTXO set. Because even if you are like this ultralight wallet and you just keep track and validate transactions that pay to that wallet, you can't predict in advance what UTXO would be used to pay to that wallet. So in order to actually validate transactions, even if it's a very small subset of transactions, you still need the entire UTXO set. So instead of trying to prune the UTXO set, which is impossible, there are attempts to limit the growth of the state bloat, and I'm going to talk very quickly about 4 approaches. The first approach is a collection of approaches which I call just the naive approaches. It's just the first thing you would think about. You would think about it for a minute, you would come up with these ideas, you would think about it for 2 more minutes, and you'll realize that they don't work. I'm just gonna give it to get the discussion going. In a second. The second approach is an economic approach. It's somehow economically incentivize people to use their money and not let it sit. And that's not creating more and more and more UTXOs. The third approach is the cryptographic approach, using cryptography, voodoo, and magic to somehow arrange information differently in a way that solves this problem. And the fourth approach is what I'm calling Michael's approach. It's a joint work by Jonathan Sampolinsky and Michael Sutton and myself, but it all revolves around this one crazy idea that Michael Sutton had that I will get into. So the most naive approach would be set up a minimum fee. If there is some sort of minimum fee, then you can create tons of UTXO because it costs you money. Each fee costs you money, so if it costs $1 to create a UTXO, then people will not create 100 billion UTXOs. So the problem is, how do you choose the fee? If you overshoot the fee, then you would exclude valid transactions because the price of the fee would be too high and people wouldn't be able to use your network. If you undershoot the fee, then you haven't accomplished anything, and spamming the network is still easy and cheap. And essentially it requires to adjust the protocol according to external data, essentially according to the market value of storage monetized by your coins and stuff like that. So this very simple solution becomes very complicated very fast. Another idea is, okay, why don't we just allow transactions that don't increase the life size of the UTXOs? If you create UTXOs, you must also consume UTXOs, or just be fined, heavily fined if you don't. So the problem with this is essentially that the most common type of transactions are 1 to 2. You pay from one source UTXO, and the money is split between a one destination UTXO and one change UTXO. So 1 to 2 is essentially the most common type of transaction, of transaction. Transactions naturally increase the UTXO. And more than that, an attacker can use just 1 to 2 UTXOs, the most common type of transactions, the most common type of transactions, to do a lot of damage. I mean, just 1 to 2 is enough. So limiting just 1 to 2 doesn't solve the problem at all. So these kind of naive approaches essentially fail miserably, and the problem is a bit more delicate than that. Regarding the economic approaches, I'm going to talk about one approach that is called demurrage. I'm seeing it is starting to gain some popularity in some projects. Demurrage essentially means that if you sit on the money for a long time, it starts to lose its value, and it becomes less. The amount of coin in the UTXO literally decreases, and the money removed is either burned or recycled into emission. And I think the main problem with this thing is just that it violates the first law of crypto. You don't mess with the users' wallets. But other than that, it means that if you're inattentive, you can lose money for that. If you lost your key, you can lose money for that, and you wouldn't get the money back if you somehow recover the key. And beside that, it also creates, it depends on if you burn or recycle, but if you burn, it creates unpredictable inflation. And if you recycle, it creates unpredictable emissions. So I think it's an all-around bad idea. It's very, very well-roundedly bad. And the cryptographic approaches, again, the most common approach is something called an accumulator. It's actually a really nice idea. The idea of an accumulator is that you can take a set of strings, say the strings represent UTXOs, and you can decompose them into a short string that represents the set A, say of UTXO, and for any element of the set, for any UTXO, a short witness. And you have a verification procedure. Essentially, if you give it the representation of the set A along with an element X from the set and a witness for X, it will return true. But creating fake proofs is very infeasible. You can't create a UTXO that doesn't exist and find a proof for it. It's unfeasible cryptographically. So it sounds like a marvelous idea, right? The node only stores this short string that represents the UTXO set, and every user has to keep the witnesses and then they include the witness in the transaction when they try to spend this UTXO. So where is the problem here? The problem here is that adding or removing elements would change existing witnesses. There is no way. I think there is actually an impossibility result that says that it's impossible. I'm not sure about it, but I'm sure that there is currently no known way to create updatable accumulators that allow you to add and remove elements without having some of the witnesses changed. And this essentially means that the user has to be constantly online to see that their proof wasn't updated. And recreating a proof could be very hard. In Bitcoin, for example, you will need to download a huge chunk of the chain and validate it and build the proof accordingly, like from the proof you have all the way to today. And in prompt chains, it even becomes impossible unless there is some archive service or something like that. Another big problem is that these witnesses cannot be generated from the seed. Essentially, even if you have the seed, you can generate all of the keys used to create the UTXO from it, but you can't generate the proof. So unless you managed your witnesses really well and didn't lose them or can somehow recreate them because luckily you have access to an archive, it essentially means that if you lose your wallet, then even if you have your seed, you still don't necessarily have access to your money, which is it essentially negates the entire idea of HD wallets. Okay, so what is Michael's approach? And this is a joint work of Jonathan Sompolinsky and Michael Stoughton and myself. And the idea is this. We want to penalize bad transactions, like in the naive solution, but we want to do it right. So the difficult question here is, how do we quantify how bad a transaction is and how much we should penalize it? But before that, we need to ask ourselves, how do we even charge the penalty? How do we monetize it? We can't monetize it in Kaspa, right? Because we don't know what Kaspa is going to be worth. So we need to find some other way to monetize it. So does anyone here maybe have an idea? Nice, so it's a more clever idea than I thought. The idea is that, okay, so I said the best solution is to just go charge in the native coin, but then you make assumptions about its value. And the good solution is to use block space. The worse a transaction is, the more block space it would waste. And this is nice because if the network is sufficiently active, then this block space is organically converted to value by the market itself. And because what determines the price or the fee you would have to pay for a bad transaction is the miners and how much fee they charge right now, it automatically adjusts itself to the network conditions. And even if the network is completely not active at all, and you can get 100% of the block space for zero fees, because we eat up the block space with bad transactions, the throughput of the network itself is going to limit the effectiveness of your attack. Okay, we call this penalty storage mass. We use the term mass. Each transaction has mass, and each block has maximal mass. And storage mass is the amount of mass that you pay for how badly your transaction affects the storage of the system. So, okay, what is the challenge we're trying to solve? The idea is that we want to make the total cost of an attack, and I'm talking about the entire attack. It doesn't matter how you segment it into transactions. This should apply to all possible attacks at once, relying just on the state of the storage before the attack started and after it ended. We want to make the total cost in terms of mass quadratic in the amount of storage that was wasted by the transaction. So the main limitation is that the formula for the mass itself, it must be local. The only information you can use when you quantify the badness of a transaction is its inputs and its outputs. You can look at the values of the inputs and the outputs, but you can't look at other transactions. You have to work locally for each transaction separately. And the basic idea is say, okay, the more space you use up, the worse the transaction is, and the more space it's going to eat. But what's the abstraction here? That if you only look at the number of UTXOs and you don't care about the values, then we can prove that in any such formula that doesn't take the actual values into account, there is always an attack that is linear, that the amount of block space it eats up is linear in the amount of storage it eats up. So we need to dive a little deeper and see exactly how the values themselves are changed by the transaction. So again, a basic idea is that every transaction it is credited for the storage that it frees, but charged for the storage that it creates. But the amount that it is credited is only depends on the entire value of the transaction. But the amount that it is charged is chosen in such a way that if the outputs are poorly spread, if you have very small and very large outputs to the same transaction, then the penalty would be very high. So here I wrote the formula itself. You don't really have to understand it. The point is that if you look at the red, the charge, you go over all of the outputs, and for each one you take 1 over its value. So if you have a very, very small output, this thing explodes to infinity. But if all of your outputs are pretty much the same, then it would just look like 1 over the value, about, and will cancel out. And the charge on the other side is the amount of storage you freed squared over the entire value of the transaction. And this parameter C is how we convert from these weird units of storage squared over money into just mass storage. So in Kaspa we set C to be 10 to the 12th volts, which is about 10,000 Kaspa, and the max mass of a block could be 500,000 grams. So let's see the consequences of this thing. So there is this theorem which proves that this formula is really magical. It's essentially said that what we wanted that would happen really does happen. If I have an attack with budget P that increases the UTXO set by n entries, then the mass that it will require is at least this constant C, but the important part is n squared. The squared is the important part. It will always grow quadratically in the number of storage that you wasted. And this creates this kind of trade-off between budget and throughput. You can either have a very expensive and fast attack, or you can have a cheap but slow attack. And so to illustrate this, if we look at a 10 BPS Kaspa network, and say I want to spam 1 gigabyte worth of storage, then say I have a fixed budget of 20,000 Kaspa, it would take me about a year and a half to burn 1 gigabyte. On the other hand, if I want to spam 1 gigabyte within 1 day, it would cost me 2.5 million Kaspa, which is about $300,000 today. So it's a really nice trade-off. And I think the main advantage of this thing is that it only requires very minor changes to the transaction construction logic. So like exchanges and wallets would need to do slight adjustment for very low value transactions, but other than that, the user experience remains completely the same. And which is a very, very large advantage when you think about the previous solutions which completely changed the way a transaction is validated and the responsibility of the user. Now, one cool thing about it is that we can use it to upper bound the entire growth. And so we're now imagining the worst possible scenario. What is the worst possible scenario? That the entire Kaspa network decided that their goal is to increase storage as much as possible. And they all cooperate to do the worst thing possible. If this is indeed the case, by how much can they cause the UTXO set to grow? And I remind you, this is the utter worst possible scenario. A very, very loose bound. But even though it's utter worst, we see that within a year, they can grow the UTXO set by at most 10 terabytes. Within 10 years, it becomes 25 terabytes. To reach 100 terabytes would take more than 150 years, and it keeps going like that. To reach 1,000 terabytes will take 15,000 years. Now, maybe 10 terabytes for the UTXO set sounds like a lot, and it is a lot, but I do remind you this is, again, the worst possible scenario. And just for comparison, without this thing, without this percussion, any attacker can very cheaply increase the storage constantly at a rate of 180 terabytes per year. So they can do it every year again and again and again, and within 1 year, they can do more damage they can do in 150 years with this percussion in place. So yeah, we are not going to get to a 10 terabyte UTXO set, because again, it requires the entire network to do the absolute worst thing possible. But for a loose bound that is comparable to bounds of petabytes and exabyte, I think it really demonstrates just how powerful this method is. And one thing that's really cool about this method is that it generalizes. It could be extended beyond the UTXO test to essentially any kind of decentralized use of storage. Like if you have a smart contract system, abstract account, whatever. It doesn't matter what your state is. The only thing that matters is that you can know in advance how much storage the transaction is going to take up. And the idea is that you lock coin for the privilege to use storage, and you look at two parameters, the amount of space that you need to use and the amount of time that you need the storage for. And then you use them in the previous formula, sort of instead of the space and time there. So it requires some adaptation, an economic model that monetizes how much money you lose by locking money instead of using it to gain interest in other avenues. But if you accept this model, which is a very common and accepted model, then you see that you can create this sort of anti-bloat that makes storage attacks very costly and essentially any kind of a decentralized system that allows user to take up storage, not just as UTXOs, but as anything. We even have this toy specification specifically for EVM. So if you want more details, then first look up Kaspa Improvement Proposal 9. It has a lot of discussion and motivation in general, not just about Kaspa. And you can follow us in the coming weeks. We are going to post a preprint and submit this result to a few conferences. So a more academic and organized discussion will be available soon too. And that's it. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you for coming and listening.